Her mother's hands were always cool and wet from the clay. She remembers kneeling inside the lodge while her mother pressed mud against the grass layer and patted it flat, working the surface smooth with both palms. The timber rib behind the wall rang when you knocked it. The pactor thudded, a sound with no echo, no give. Her mother knocked both and waited until she heard the difference. Wind pushes what stands alone, her mother said. Earth holds by weight. Decades later, on a stretch of Nebraska prairie with no trees, no stone, no claim, and a grandchild coughing blood into a blanket, she would need that lesson the way a drowning person needs the surface. Mara Little Crane stood in mud that had frozen overnight and thawed by noon, the kind that gripped a boot heel and held it like a mouth. Ash Creek Crossing, in the autumn of 1874, was not a town so much as an argument between lumber and dirt. 6 frame cabins in various states of undress, a mercantile with canvas where its north wall should have been, and a road that existed only because wagon wheels had killed the grass in the same ruts enough times to call it intention. The settlement sat on a low bench above the Loup River's South Fork, exposed on 3 sides to prairie that ran flat and treeless to the horizon. There was no windbreak. There was no ridge. There was nothing between Ash Creek Crossing and the sky except the stubbornness of people who had driven stakes into dirt and called it home. Mara had not driven stakes. She had no claim deed, no homestead filing, no piece of paper that a white court east of the Missouri would hold up and call legitimate. What she had was a draft horse named Moss, who was older than most of the settlers' marriages. $4.70 in trade coin knotted into a rag at the bottom of her belt pouch, a half sack of cornmeal that weighed less every morning, and 2 children who were not hers by birth but were hers by every measure that mattered. Sari was 11 and already carried water like a woman twice her age. Toma was 7, thin as a willow switch, and coughed in the mornings with a sound that made Mara's hands go still over whatever task they held. The cough had blood in it now, not much, flecks, like rust on a nailhead. But Mara had watched enough sick children to know that blood-flecked phlegm in autumn meant a chest that would not survive a plains winter without warmth, shelter, and rest. Toma needed walls. He needed a roof that did not leak. He needed a fire that burned through the night without wind snuffing it sideways across a dirt floor. And Mara could not leave. Sari had made that clear with the particular silence of a child who has already decided. Her mother, Mara's daughter, was buried on the creek rise a quarter-mile east under a cairn of river stones that Sari visited every morning before the sun cleared the grass. The nearest Pawnee relatives were south, weeks of travel through country that grew more hostile to a lone Pawnee woman with children every season. There was no money for a stage. There was no invitation waiting. The world had narrowed to this mud, this settlement, this stretch of open prairie where the wind came from the northwest, like it owned the deed to everything. Milton Vale owned the next best thing. He was the town site agent, the lumber broker, and the informal creditor who had attached himself to Ash Creek Crossing the way a tick attaches to a dog, by arriving first and burrowing deep. Vale was 44, lean-faced, with a mustache he groomed more carefully than his accounts, and a voice that carried the particular authority of a man who controlled what other people needed. He sold milled boards on credit at rates that would bind a family for 2 winters of labor. He filed claims on abandoned property before the abandoners had cleared the county line, and he had noticed the broken medicine wagon sitting half sunk in the roadside ditch at the settlement's eastern edge, the one Mara had been sleeping beside for 11 days. The wagon had belonged to a traveling medicine show that had passed through in summer, sold colored water to desperate people, and left the wagon behind when an axle cracked on the ford. It was large for a show wagon, roughly 11 feet 8 inches long and 5 feet wide inside, with a solid wooden shell built to protect glass bottles from road jolts. It had no windows. One wheel was shattered. The painted slogan on its side, "Dr. Bell's tonic cures what ails you," had faded to a whisper under road dust and rain, but the shell was intact. The boards were thick, and the ditch it sat in was deep enough that the wind, which never stopped on this stretch of prairie, passed over the wagon's roof without catching it. Vale had noticed the wagon because Vale noticed everything that could be converted to cash or leverage. He posted a salvage notice on the 3rd day of October. The wagon and its ditch were town property, and the wood would be auctioned for salvage in 9 days unless a valid claim was produced. He delivered this news to Mara in person, standing upwind so she had to squint against the grit his coat threw, holding the paper at an angle that required her to step forward to read it. Mara did not step forward. She asked how deep the ditch was where the wind could not touch. Vale did not answer the question. He told her 9 days, turned his horse, and rode back toward the mercantile where men with hammers and sawdust on their sleeves would hear his version of the conversation before Mara's boots dried. The morning after Vale's visit, Levi Rook came to look at the wagon. Rook was the settlement's carpenter, hired from Iowa on the promise of steady work and paid partly in lumber credit that kept him tethered to Vale's books. He was 49, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had built enough frame cabins to carry the calluses like credentials. He wore a leather apron even when he was not working, the way some men wore a badge. The settlers trusted him because he measured before he cut, and because his joints held through the first winter, which was more than the last carpenter could claim. He walked the site the way a doctor walks a sick room, slowly, touching things, shaking his head at intervals, calibrated to communicate professional disappointment. He tapped the wagon roof with his knuckles. He kicked the broken wheel. He crouched at the ditch edge and sighted along the grade. He stood, brushed his knees, and delivered his verdict to Mara as if she had asked for it, which she had not. "You have half a wagon," Rook said. "One wheel gone, the axle cracked, the tongue split halfway. The ditch is shallow, 4 feet at most, and it slopes wrong. Water will sit in there like a bathtub after the first good rain." He pointed north, where the prairie ran flat and pale to the sky. "There is no timber within 5 miles worth cutting. There is no stone worth hauling closer than the river bluff, and that is 3 miles with a bad grade." He looked at Moss, who stood hip-shot and patient in the grass. "That horse cannot pull a frame's worth of logs. He cannot pull a foundation's worth of stone. He can barely pull himself." Mara waited. Rook continued. "A house needs upright walls, corner posts set deep, and a pitched roof with enough angle to shed snow. You need milled boards, nails, rafters, and glass if you want light. You need a stove, a stovepipe, and enough clearance between the pipe and the roof that you do not burn alive the first night you fire it." He tapped the wagon again, harder this time. "This is a box. You cannot hide from weather in a box." Mara said, "Your walls sing." Rook stopped. "Your newest cabin," Mara said. "The one facing west. The wind hums through the boards where you have not chinked. I can hear it from here when the air moves." Rook's jaw tightened. Unchinked boards were not a failure of skill, but a failure of time. He had not finished because Vale had pushed him to start the next cabin before the first was sealed. But Mara had named the weakness in front of Sari, who was watching from the wagon bed, and in front of a homesteader named Ansel Brackett, who had stopped his mule on the road to listen. "Chinking is a matter of days," Rook said. "What you need is a matter of months you do not have." He left, but his inventory had done exactly what inventories do. It had measured the distance between what Mara had and what she needed, and the distance was a chasm. A framed cabin required materials she could not buy, labor she could not hire, time she could not borrow, and a claim she could not file. The arithmetic was not difficult, it was impossible. That night, Toma coughed until his blanket was spotted. Sari boiled creek water and held the tin cup to his lips. Mara sat with her back against the wagon wheel that still worked and watched the stars through air that smelled like dust and distance, and the particular metallic edge that preceded weather she had learned to read before she learned to read anything written on paper. She knew what was coming, not the way a fortune teller claims to know, but the way a woman who has lived 63 years on open prairie knows. The way a sailor knows swell, the way a farmer knows the color of hail light. The grass had bent in the same direction 3 mornings running. The birds had gone quiet before sundown for a week. The air tasted of soil that had been lifted from somewhere far west and carried on a current that had not yet shown its full speed. Mara called it razor wind. The settlers called that superstition. They had felt strong gusts before. Everyone on the plains had felt strong gusts. And the proper response was to brace a wall, board a window, and wait. Wind was an inconvenience. It was not a force that could dismantle a town. Mara had seen a gale peel bark from cottonwood trees in strips as long as a man's arm. She had seen frozen sand driven hard enough to blood a horse's flank and leave welts on human skin that lasted weeks. She had seen a roof lifted from an earth lodge and carried spinning until it broke apart over the river like a hand releasing cards. The settlers had not seen these things because the settlers had not been here long enough to see them. Their experience was measured in seasons. Hers was measured in decades. But experience without a plan was just worry. And worry did not build walls. The idea did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a horse making a decision. 3 days after Rook's visit, a gust hit the settlement hard enough to rattle loose boards and send a tin bucket cartwheeling down the main road. Mara was leading Moss back from the creek when the gust struck. Moss did not bolt. He did not rear. He backed up, methodically, 1 step at a time, until his hindquarters pressed against the ditch bank and his body dropped below the prairie line. The wind tore over his back. Dust sheeted across at the height where his eyes had been a moment before. But down in the ditch, the air shivered without cutting. Mara crouched beside him. She felt the difference on her own face. Above the ditch lip, the wind was a blade. Below it, the air moved but did not tear. The ditch was only 4 feet deep. Rook had been right about that. But 4 feet was enough to break the wind's grip on anything that did not rise above the surface. She stayed in the ditch for a long time after the gust passed, pressing her palm flat against the earth wall. It was cold. It was damp, but it was still. The dirt did not vibrate the way a plank wall vibrated. It did not flex. It absorbed force the way a body of water absorbs a thrown stone, by spreading it in every direction at once until the energy had nowhere left to go. A memory opened, not suddenly, not with the sharp clarity that stories assign to memories, but slowly, the way a door swings on old hinges. Mara was 9 years old, standing inside an earth lodge, while her mother repaired a wall damaged by spring rain. The lodge was not the cone-shaped dwelling that white illustrators drew in their books. It was a timber frame covered with branches, then grass, then packed earth, a structure that had sheltered Pawnee families for generations in a country where timber was scarce and wind was not. Her mother did not speak in riddles or proverbs. She demonstrated. She pressed wet clay against the grass layer, patted it flat with both hands, and showed Mara how the surface sealed when the clay dried. She knocked on the dry wall with her knuckle, and then knocked on an exposed timber rib. The timber rang, the earth thudded. Wind pushes what stands alone, her mother said. Earth holds by weight. It was not a spiritual lesson. It was physics delivered by a woman with mud under her fingernails and a practical understanding of how force moves through materials. Wind pushes hard against a vertical surface because the surface gives it something to push against. A wall is a sail, a roof with pitch is a wing, but earth that is flush with the ground offers almost nothing, no edge to grip, no face to strike, no angle to exploit. The wind passes over it the way water passes over a river stone, dividing and reuniting on the other side without the stone moving. Mara stood in the ditch beside Moss and looked at the medicine wagon. It was a box. Rook had been right about that, but Rook had imagined the box sitting on the surface, exposed, a target. Mara imagined it sitting below the surface, buried, its roof at ground level, its walls surrounded by packed earth, its gaps sealed with clay and sod. A rigid wooden shell, windowless, heavy, and small enough to be lowered whole into a trench deep enough to swallow it. A freestanding cabin gave the Gale 4 walls to grab. A sunken wagon gave it almost nothing. The design built itself in her mind as she walked the ditch. The trench would need to be wider than the wagon by 2 feet on each side, room for earth packing and drainage. It would need to be deep enough that the wagon roof sat 4 inches below grade, so sod and clay could be packed flush across the top. A sloped ramp on one end for entry. A stone-lined sump at the lowest corner to collect water. 2 vent pipes made from salvaged stovepipe, rising no higher than a badger mound, angled so wind could not drive rain straight down. Cottonwood ribs braced inside to carry the weight of the sod cap. Every element was available. Every element was period material she had seen, touched, or used before. The risk was also clear. If she dug too shallow, wind would catch the roof edge and peel it. If she dug too deep, water would pool and cold would settle in the hole like something alive. If the wagon shifted during lowering, it would crush moss or crack the shell and become useless. If the vents were angled wrong, the people inside would suffocate or choke on their own fire smoke. If the sod cap was too thin, it would lift. If it was too heavy, the roof would buckle. Every failure point could kill her. Every failure point could kill her grandchildren. She decided anyway, because the alternative was no shelter at all, and no shelter on the Nebraska prairie in winter was not a risk, it was a certainty. Ansel Brackett caught her digging the next morning. Brackett was 36, square-built, with the sunburned neck and guarded eyes of a homesteader who had invested everything he had, his savings, his pregnant wife Clara's faith, and 2 cows that represented their entire margin against starvation, in 160 acres of grass that had not yet produced a single crop. He was not cruel. He was not stupid. He was frightened in the particular way that men with dependents are frightened, which meant his fear came out as practicality. He stood at the ditch edge and watched Mara swing a mattock into clay-heavy soil. She had been digging since first light. Her hands were already raw. Sari was carrying loosened dirt in a kettle to the spoil pile. "What happens when it rains?" Brackett asked. Mara did not stop digging. She pointed the mattock head at a shallow test trench she had cut the day before. 18 inches deep, sloped at one end toward a small pit lined with flat creek stones. "Watch," she said. Sari poured a bucket of water at the high end. The water ran downhill, gathered speed over the packed clay bottom, and pooled in the stone-lined pit. It did not spread. It did not seep sideways. It followed the grade. "That is a bucket," Brackett said. "Rain is not a bucket." "Rain falls everywhere," Mara said. "When the roof is flush with the ground, rain runs across it the same way it runs across the prairie. It does not pool on a flat surface. It finds the lowest edge. The sump catches what enters the door. The slope moves it. Brackett was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the second question. What happens when the roof comes down? Mara set the mattock aside. She placed a flat board across the top of the test trench, spanning the 2-foot gap. She piled sod on top, heavy, wet, root-tangled clumps of prairie earth. The board bowed. She heard the wood creak. Then she took a cottonwood branch, trimmed to length, and wedged it upright under the center of the board. The bowing stopped. The sod held. One prop, Mara said. The wagon will have 4. The roof is thicker than this board. The span is wider, but the props carry the weight straight down. Brackett stared at the test. The sod sat motionless. The branch did not lean. He looked at the wagon, then at the ditch, then at Mara. What happens when the door freezes shut? He asked. I will keep a fire inside, Mara said. The entry faces east, away from the prevailing wind. The ramp slopes down. Snow will drift past, not into. If ice forms, a fire melts it. Brackett did not nod. He did not say she was right, but his mouth changed. The set of it loosened from mockery into something closer to worry. Worry was better than laughter. Worry meant he was calculating instead of dismissing. He left without helping, but he looked back twice. Milton Vale did not wait for the auction to begin his campaign. He started at the mercantile stove, where men gathered in the evenings to warm their hands and trade complaints about weather, prices, and the government in equal portions. She's digging a grave, Vale said, loud enough for the room but aimed at the 2 men nearest the stove. Digging a grave and calling it wisdom. He paused to let the image settle. If people follow her example, we will be living like animals instead of building a proper town. Holes in the ground, mud on the roof. Is that what you filed a claim for? Is that what you brought your wife out here to live in? The insult carried weight beyond its words. It reached into something older and deeper than one woman digging a trench. It reached into the settlers' need to believe they were building civilization, not retreating from it. Earth-built shelters were native architecture. They were poor people's architecture. They were what you lived in before you could afford to live in something a man from back east would recognize as a house. Vale understood this. He was selling lumber, but he was also selling an idea. The idea that vertical walls and glass windows and pitched roofs were the markers of progress, and anything less was a step backward toward a life the settlers had crossed a continent to escape. Levi Rook added his own objection, not from malice, but from professional certainty. He had 4 frame cabins half raised. Every nail in them represented his authority, his skill, his value to the settlement. If a Pawnee woman with a broken wagon and a shovel could build something that survived a gale, his certainty cracked. Not his cabins, his certainty. And certainty was the only currency a carpenter on the plains had that was worth more than his lumber. Rook found Mara at the trench edge on the 5th day. 2 younger carpenters trailed behind him, watching the way apprentices watch when their master is about to deliver a verdict. Rook tapped his hammer against the wagon roof, a gesture he performed with the casual precision of a man who communicated through tools the way other men communicated through handshakes. This roof, he said, was meant to keep off rain. It was not meant to hold the earth. Mara was measuring the trench width with a length of cord. She did not look up. Your cabin walls, she said, were they meant to hold the wind? One of the younger carpenters almost smiled. Rook saw it, and his face hardened. A frame cabin has posts set 3 feet deep, Rook said. It has diagonal bracing. It has a pitched roof that sheds load. It has 100 years of building knowledge behind it. What you have is a hole in a box. A frame cabin has 4 walls, Mara said. Each wall is a surface for the wind to press against. Your diagonal braces help the corners hold, but the surface is still there. The wind does not need to break a wall. It needs to find one edge where the boards are not tight, one seam where the chinking has dried and cracked, and then it pulls. It unravels your cabin the way you unravel a knot, not by breaking the rope, but by finding the loose end. Rook's jaw worked. He knew about loose ends. His newest cabin already hummed when the wind shifted northwest. "And your wagon?" he said. "When the mudcap cracks in the freeze, the wind will find your seams too." "Mud cracks on a vertical surface," Mara said. "It does not crack the same on a horizontal surface under weight. The sod holds the clay down. Gravity does the chinking for me." Rook left. He did not admit she had a point, because admitting a point would have cost him standing with the 2 young men who followed him. But he had come to dismiss and left with a question he could not answer, and that question would sit in his chest like a stone until the wind answered it for both of them. The most visible mockery happened on the road 2 days later. 3 men, freighters passing through on their way to the river crossing, stopped their wagon and watched Mara cut the trench outline wider. She was using a sharpened rib bone as a marking tool, driving it into the earth and pulling a cord taut between stakes to check the corners for square. Sari held the far stake. One of the freighters leaned from his seat and called to his partner, "Old woman's making a coffin with a door." The second man laughed. The third said nothing but watched Mara's hands. She drove the next stake without looking up. She pulled the cord tight. She checked the corner by sighting down the line with one eye closed. A gesture so precise and practiced that it did not look like a woman guessing. It looked like a woman who had measured things before the men on the wagon were born. Her silence made the scene sharper than any argument could have. The freighters moved on. The phrase "stayed behind" passed from mouth to mouth in the settlement like a coin rubbed smooth by handling. "She's digging a grave big enough for herself." Mara heard it. She kept digging. On the 6th day, Vale posted the salvage notice on the wagon itself, a paper nailed to the sideboards where Mara could not miss it. Salvage auction in 6 days. The paper was dated. The nail was driven through the wood with more force than a notice required. 6 days. Mara had widened the trench to 10 feet. Not enough. She needed 14 feet long and 8 feet wide, with the ramp cut on the east side and the sump dug at the lowest corner. The digging was slower than she had hoped because the soil changed character at 3 feet. Clay gave way to a gravel layer that blunted the mattock and made every stroke ring up through her wrists. Her palms had split along the lines where calluses met new blisters. She wrapped them in strips torn from an old shirt, and the strips turned brown with blood and dirt by midday. Sari carried clay in the kettle until the handle raised a bruise across her fingers that she tried to hide by keeping her hands in her skirt. Mara saw it anyway. She made Sari stop carrying and start mixing water and clay in a salvaged barrel, stirred with a broken axe handle until the consistency was thick enough to smear and hold. Toma sat in the wagon bed and coughed. The sound had changed. It was deeper now, wetter, coming from lower in his chest. Mara checked his sputum each morning the way a miner checks the color of water seeping into a shaft, not because she wanted to see what was there, but because not looking was worse. The flecks were still small, still rust-colored, still few. But the cough came more often, and Toma was thinner each day, and his eyes had the bright too-alert look of a child whose body was burning fuel it did not have. The evening of the 6th day, Mara stood in the trench and looked at what she had accomplished. The bottom was flat. The west wall was shored with stakes and horizontal boards salvaged from a collapsed fence line. The east ramp was cut but too steep. She would need to lengthen it another 3 feet. The sump corner was marked but not dug. The wagon sat above, still in the ditch, waiting to be lowered into a space that did not yet exist for it. 6 days of digging, 6 more days until the auction. And the trench was less than half ready. She climbed out and sat on the spoil pile. The western sky was green-gray at the horizon, the color of weather that was still deciding what to become. The grass moved in one direction. The air smelled of cold metal and dust from someplace far away. Then a voice came from behind the wagon, quiet, unhurried. A man's voice, but without the aggression that the men of Ash Creek Crossing seemed to carry like a second set of tools. That wagon never cured anyone. Mara turned. A man stood at the corner of the medicine wagon, one hand resting on the sideboard where the painted slogan was barely visible in the evening light. He was tall, long-limbed, with the kind of lean strength that comes from decades of physical work rather than the bulk of youth. His skin was dark. His clothes were worn but not ragged. A canvas coat, heavy trousers patched at both knees, boots that had been resoled more than once. He wore no hat, and his hair was close-cropped and gray at the temples. He read the slogan aloud. "Dr. Bell's tonic cures what ails you." He shook his head. That tonic was creek water, molasses, and enough alcohol to make a man forget he was still sick. He looked at Mara. But the box might still carry weight. Mara studied him. He was not looking at her the way settlers looked at her, through her, past her, at the space she occupied as though calculating what it would be worth without her in it. He was looking at the wagon the way Rook looked at joinery. He was reading the structure. "You know this wagon," Mara said. "I drove it," the man said. "Not for the medicine show. Before that, this wagon was an army freight box before someone bolted sideboards on it and painted it pretty. I drove freight for the Army and the Railroad Survey out of Fort Kearney for 6 years. Wagons like this one hauled powder, hardtack, and tools through country that broke lighter rigs in a week." He tapped the sideboard. "The frame is white oak. The floor is double planked. The joints are bolted, not nailed. This box was built to carry 2,000 pounds over rough road without twisting. It is stronger than any cabin wall in this settlement." His name was Ephraim Bell. He was 58 years old. He had served in the Union Army, not as a soldier, but as a teamster, one of the men who kept wagons moving when the supply lines stretched thin and the roads turned to mud. After the war, he had freighted for the railroad survey crews pushing west, hauling instruments and timber, and the 1,000 small necessities that made the railroad possible without ever putting his name on a map. He knew wagon loads, cribbing techniques, block and tackle rigging, axle mechanics, drainage cuts, and how timber fails under strain. He knew these things the way Mara knew weather, not from books, but from years of watching, lifting, and learning what broke and what held. He had arrived at Ash Creek Crossing 3 days ago, looking for work. No one had hired him. A black teamster without a wagon of his own was useful in theory and invisible in practice. He had been sleeping in the open, eating what he could find, and walking the settlement's edges the way all men on the margins walk, quietly, watching, taking the measure of what was built and what was likely to fall. He had watched Mara dig. He had watched her measure. And he had recognized something that Rook, Brackett, and Vale had missed entirely. He had recognized competence. "Your trench corners are nearly square," Ephraim said. "The grade on your ramp is too steep, but the bottom is level. You know what you're building." "I know what I am building," Mara said. "I do not know if I can build it in 6 days." Ephraim looked at the trench, then at the wagon, then at the sky. "You cannot," he said. Not alone. He stepped into the trench. He picked up the mattock, and he began to dig. Not because he pitied her, not because she had asked, because he had seen enough structures built and enough structures fail to know the difference between a woman guessing and a woman engineering, and the woman in the trench was engineering. The first thing he taught her was not a technique, but a correction. Mara's trench corners were close to square, close enough for eyesight, close enough for someone working alone with a cord and stakes, but close was not square. Ephraim took the cord, measured the diagonal from corner to corner, then measured the opposite diagonal. The difference was 2 inches. On a small structure where the roof must sit flush with the grade on all 4 sides, 2 inches meant a gap where wind could enter and water could pool. He showed Mara how to correct it. Shorten one diagonal by driving a stake inward, then remeasure. 1 rope, 2 measurements. A correction that took 10 minutes and would prevent a failure that would have been invisible until the first hard rain. Mara watched, adjusted, and did not need to be shown again. Ephraim said, "You learn the way mules learn, once." "Mules learn because they remember pain," Mara said. "So do people," Ephraim said. "The smart ones just learn faster." The sun dropped behind the green-gray horizon. The wind picked up. Somewhere in the settlement, a loose board banged against a frame cabin wall like a hand slapping a table, regular and sharp, and not quite loud enough to be alarming. Not yet. If you have ever been doubted by someone who could not see what you were building, tell us in the comments. The spoil pile grew. The trench deepened. Mara's palms bled through the wrappings and dried and bled again. Sari mixed clay until her arms trembled. Toma coughed in the wagon bed above them like a clock they could not stop, and the sky to the northwest darkened another shade. Ephraim Bell worked the way water works on stone, steady, unhurried, and impossible to stop. By the second morning of their partnership, the trench had deepened to 5 feet along the west wall, and Mara understood that what she had lacked was not strength, but method. Ephraim did not dig faster than she did. He dug smarter. He read the soil the way she read the sky, not as a single substance, but as layers, each with its own character. The top 18 inches were root-bound prairie sod, dense and heavy, but cuttable in blocks that could be stacked and reused for the roof cap. Below that was clay, workable when damp, stubborn when dry. Below the clay was the gravel layer that had punished Mara's wrists for days. "You do not fight gravel," Ephraim said. He was kneeling in the trench with a salvaged iron bar, prying a stone the size of a man's fist from the compacted layer. "You loosen it, lift it, move it, same as freight. The load does not care how strong you are. It cares whether you understand where the weight sits." He taught the lesson through the stone. He wedged the bar under one edge, levered upward, caught the stone as it popped free, and tossed it onto the spoil pile in one motion. Then he handed the bar to Mara. She repeated the movement. The next stone came free in half the time. Sari watched from the trench edge, and then slid down to join them, collecting loosened gravel in the kettle and hauling it up the ramp. The ramp itself was Ephraim's first major contribution to the design. Mara had cut it at a steep angle to save digging. Ephraim made her crawl up it carrying a sack of cornmeal, the weight of a sleeping child. She slipped at the halfway point. Her knee struck the clay. The cornmeal sack rolled to the bottom. "Steep gets you killed in the dark," Ephraim said. "Steep gets you killed when your hands are full. Steep gets you killed when your boots are wet." He pointed at the ramp. 3 more feet of length, shallower grade, you will thank the extra digging every time you carry a child through that entry. Mara extended the ramp. 3 more feet of digging. 3 more feet that would save a life she had not yet imagined saving. The trench dimensions grew precise: 14 feet long, 8 feet wide, 7 feet deep at the center, with the east ramp rising at a grade gentle enough for a woman carrying weight in the dark. The stone-lined sump occupied the lowest corner, a pit 2 feet deep and 18 inches across, lined with flat creek stones that Sari carried from the river in 6 trips, each trip a quarter-mile each way. The sump's purpose was simple. Water flows downhill. Every surface inside the trench angled toward that corner. Rain that entered through the doorway, condensation that dripped from the roof, groundwater that seeped through the walls, all of it would find the sump and sit there, instead of spreading across the floor where people slept. Ephraim inspected the sump by pouring 4 buckets of water at the trench's highest point and watching the flow. 3 buckets reached the sump within minutes. The 4th pooled against the north wall where the grade was too flat. He and Mara spent an hour recutting the floor angle by less than an inch. The 4th bucket's water reached the sump. The correction was invisible to anyone who had not crawled the floor on hands and knees. It was the difference between a dry shelter and a flooded grave. 5 days remained before Vale's auction. The trench was ready. The wagon was not. The medicine wagon sat in the original roadside ditch above the trench, its 3 good wheels on solid ground and its broken 4th corner propped on a stack of fence rails. To lower it into the new trench meant moving it 12 feet sideways and 7 feet down without cracking the shell, killing the horse, or crushing any of the people who would be standing in the path of 2,000 pounds of white oak and iron hardware. Ephraim studied the problem for half a day before he spoke. "The wagon needs to come off its wheels first," he said. "If we lower it on the wheels, the axles take the strain at 2 points. The body flexes in the middle. Oak is strong, but oak flexes when the load is wrong, and a flexed body will crack at the joints." He traced the wagon's undercarriage with his finger. "Remove the wheels. Remove the axles. Lower the body as a box, flat, evenly supported. The weight distributes across the whole bottom instead of hanging from 2 lines." This was cribbing. Ephraim explained it not as theory, but as memory. "In the army, we unloaded cannon from flat cars onto mud. You cannot just roll a cannon off a ramp. The weight digs into soft ground, and the whole piece tips. So you build a crib, timber stacks, alternating direction, each layer shorter than the one below. The load sits on the crib. You remove the bottom layer, the load drops 6 inches. You remove the next, it drops again. Controlled, slow. Every inch accounted for." He drew the plan in the dirt with a stick. The wagon body would be lifted slightly off its axles using Ephraim's block and tackle, a heavy iron and rope assembly he had carried in his pack since the war, worth more than everything else he owned combined. Once the axles were removed, the body would rest on a temporary crib built from salvaged fence rails and cottonwood poles. The crib would be positioned at the trench edge. Then, layer by layer, they would lower the wagon body into the trench by removing crib pieces and controlling the descent with ropes run through the block and tackle. Moss would provide the pulling force. Mara would guide. Sari would watch the ropes for fraying. Ephraim would manage the crib. "What happens if a rope breaks?" Mara asked. "That is why we crib," Ephraim said. "The crib holds the load at every stage. If a rope breaks, the wagon drops to the next crib layer, 6 inches, not 7 feet. You never trust rope alone. You trust wood under the load and rope to control the direction. And if the crib fails..." Ephraim was quiet for a moment. "Then you are not standing under it," he said. "That is the second rule. Never stand where a failed load will land. I have seen a man killed by a barrel of salt pork that slipped its crib. He was standing where he should not have been. The barrel did not care that he was strong. Mara absorbed this. Force did not negotiate. Force did not respect effort or intention. It went where the structure sent it, and if the structure failed, it went where gravity sent it, and gravity was the most honest judge on the prairie. The axle removal took a full day. The pins had rusted. Ephraim heated them with a small fire built against the iron, not hot enough to weaken the wood, but hot enough to expand the metal until the pins could be driven out with a hammer and a drift made from a railroad spike. Each pin required 20 minutes of steady hammering. Mara's shoulders burned. Ephraim switched hands without pausing, left, then right, then left, a rhythm learned from years of work that never stopped for comfort. The wheels came off one at a time. Each wheel was rolled to the side and laid flat. The axles were pulled free and stacked. The wagon body settled onto the temporary crib with a groan that sounded to Mara like an old woman sitting down after a long walk. The fourth day before the auction, Clara Brackett appeared at the trench edge. She came at dusk, when the light was low enough that a woman walking from the Brackett homestead would not be easily identified from the road. She carried 2 buckets. One held rendered beef fat, pale and solid. The other held strips of old canvas, stained and soft from use. "For seams," Clara said. She set the buckets at the trench edge and did not climb down. Mara looked up from the trench floor, where she was packing clay against the north wall with her palms. Her hands were cracked and dark with dried blood. Clara looked at the hands and then looked away. "The fat," Mara said. "Mixed with clay, it makes the seams resist water." "I know," Clara said. "My grandmother sealed a cellar floor with tallow and clay in Ohio. It held 10 years. She left before anyone could see her. The bucket stayed." Mara mixed the rendered fat into clay that night, working by feel in the dark, because a fire would have attracted attention from the road. The mixture was heavy and greasy, and smelled like a kitchen and a barnyard at once. She packed it into the seams between the trench walls and the crib supports, into the cracks where the wagon body's boards had shrunk apart, into every gap where wind or water could enter. The canvas strips went over the fat clay mixture as a binding layer, pressed flat and smoothed until the surface was continuous. 2 hours after Clara's visit, Ansel Brackett appeared. He did not bring supplies. He brought a shovel. He climbed into the trench without speaking. He looked at the sump, at the wall packing, at the crib assembly, at the measurements Mara had scratched into the trench floor with her marking bone. He looked for a long time. Then he began to dig. He widened the east ramp by another foot, working with the aggressive efficiency of a man who did not want to be caught doing what he was doing. He did not apologize for the days he had spent doubting. He did not explain why he had changed his mind. He dug. And when the ramp was finished, he climbed out, nodded once at Mara, and walked back toward his homestead in the dark. He was ashamed to be seen. But he was more frightened of the sky than he was of the town's opinion, and the sky to the northwest had turned the color of a bruise that would not heal. 2 days before the auction, the setbacks stacked like debts. A night rain, hard, sudden, and warmer than it should have been for October, collapsed the trench's south wall. 3 feet of carefully packed earth slumped inward and buried half the sump under wet clay. Mara and Ephraim spent 4 hours clearing it, hauling mud up the ramp in buckets that grew heavier with each trip. By the time the wall was reshored with fence rails driven horizontally into the bank, Mara's shoulders had locked into a fixed hunch that would not release until she slept. That same morning, one of the ropes they had staged for the lowering was cut. Mara found it on the ground beside the crib, severed clean, not frayed, cut. The slice was sharp and deliberate, and the rope lay exactly where someone standing on the road could have reached it without entering the trench. Mara said nothing about it to anyone except Ephraim. "Vale," Ephraim said, I cannot prove that. You do not need to prove it. You need another rope. They did not have another rope of that length. Ephraim spent the afternoon splicing two shorter ropes together using a technique he called a long splice. The strands unwound, interleaved, and relayed so the joint was no thicker than the original rope. It took 3 hours and required a steadiness of hand that Mara's cracked palms could not have managed. When it was done, Ephraim loaded the splice by hanging the full weight of the crib's heaviest timber from it. The splice held. "It will hold the wagon?" Mara asked. "It will hold the wagon," Ephraim said, "but I would not stand under it." He smiled when he said it. It was the first time Mara had seen him smile. Toma's cough worsened. The blood flecks had not increased, but the frequency had, every few minutes now, a ragged bark that shook his thin body like a wind shaking a fence post. Mara brewed a tea from dried mullein leaves she had gathered along the creek bank, a remedy her mother had used and her grandmother before that. It eased the cough for an hour, sometimes 2. Then the barking returned. There was no doctor in Ash Creek Crossing. The nearest physician was in Grand Island, 2 days' ride east. Even if Mara could make the journey, she could not pay for treatment, and she could not leave the trench unguarded with Vale's auction approaching. She held Toma at night and felt the heat of his skin through the blanket and measured his breaths the way she measured everything else, by count, by rhythm, by the gaps where the pattern broke. Levi Rook appeared on the afternoon of the second-to-last day. He did not come to mock this time. He came to watch. He stood at the trench edge for 20 minutes without speaking. Ephraim was below, adjusting the crib alignment. Mara was packing the final seam on the west wall. Sari was testing the sump drainage by pouring water from increasing heights. Rook studied the crib assembly with the eye of a man who built things for a living. His gaze followed the load lines, the way each timber sat on the one below, the way the weight of the wagon body distributed through the stack to the trench floor. He saw the diagonal bracing Ephraim had added at the base. He saw the rope routing through the block and tackle. He saw the system. "The splice will slip under shock load," Rook said. Ephraim looked up. "It is a long splice. It will not slip. I have spliced rope under cannon fire in weather worse than this." "Cannon fire does not pull sideways," Rook said. "When the wagon tips during lowering, and it will tip because the weight is not centered, the rope will take a lateral load the splice was not made for." Ephraim was quiet. He looked at the splice. He looked at the wagon. He looked at Rook. "You are right," Ephraim said. The admission hung in the air. Rook had expected argument. He had come prepared for argument. Instead, he received agreement. An agreement from a man he had dismissed left him standing at the edge of a trench without a prepared response. "A bridle hitch at the base of the block," Rook said slowly, as if the words were being pulled from him against his will. "It catches lateral force before the splice takes it." Ephraim nodded. "Show me." Rook looked at the sky. He looked at the road. He looked at his hands. Then he climbed into the trench and tied a knot that belonged to a carpenter's repertoire, not a teamster's. The bridle hitch wrapped the base of the block assembly and redirected lateral force into the crib's anchor timber. If the wagon tipped during lowering, the hitch would catch the swing before the splice carried the strain. It took him 4 minutes. He climbed out without another word and walked back toward town. Mara watched him go. "He will not help again," she said. "He already did," Ephraim said. The lowering happened on the last day before Vale's auction. The sun was not yet up. Mara had chosen the hour deliberately, early enough that the light was thin and the road was empty, late enough that she could see the ropes and the crib and the trench edges clearly. Moss stood in harness at the far end of the pull line. his breath making clouds in the cold air. The horse was patient. He had pulled heavier loads in his youth, but his youth was far behind him, and the medicine wagon's body weighed close to 900 pounds without its wheels and axles. Ephraim ran the sequence like a military operation. Short commands, no wasted words. Slack on the guideline. Sorry, watch the left rope where it crosses the crib edge. Mara, hand on the brake timber. If I call hold, you drive it into the crib gap. The wagon body sat on the crib at the trench edge, overhanging the void by 3 feet. Ephraim had positioned it so the heavy end, where the double-planked floor met the reinforced rear wall, would enter the trench first. The weight distribution mattered. If the light end went first, the heavy end would tip the body forward during descent and hammer the trench floor like a maul. Pull, Ephraim said. Moss leaned into the harness. The pull line tightened through the block and tackle. The wagon body shifted forward 2 inches. The crib groaned. Hold. Mara drove the brake timber into the gap between the first and second crib layers. The wagon stopped. Ephraim removed the bottom crib rail on the trench side. The wagon body dropped 4 inches onto the next layer. The impact sent a vibration through the crib that Mara felt in her teeth. But the structure held. Again, pull. The wagon inched forward. The front edge cleared the trench lip and hung over open space. Mara could see the trench floor 7 feet below. The flat, graded surface she had crawled on hands and knees to level, the sump in its corner, the wall packing she had sealed with her split palms. If the wagon fell now, it would destroy everything. Hold! Another crib rail removed, another 4-inch drop. The wagon was now tilted downward at the front, the rear still resting on the upper crib, the front supported by the lower stack Ephraim had pre-built inside the trench. The angle was steep, but controlled. Every inch of descent was a negotiation between gravity, rope, timber, and a horse who trembled in his harness but did not stop. The side guide rope screamed against the block housing. Mara heard the fibers stretching, a sound like fabric tearing in slow motion. The rope she had relied on for lateral control was the one Vale had cut and Ephraim had spliced. The splice held. Rook's bridle hitch caught the lateral strain, but the rope sang a note that meant it was close to its limit. Faster, Mara said. No, Ephraim said. Speed is how loads kill people. Another rail. He removed the next crib piece. The wagon dropped. Moss stumbled forward as the pull line went slack. Sorry cried out. Mara grabbed the brake timber and jammed it into the crib. The wagon caught, shuddered, and stopped. The front end was now 4 feet into the trench. The rear was still above grade. The angle was extreme. Cut the sideline, Ephraim said. Let the rear come down on the crib. This was not the plan. The plan was controlled descent on all lines, but the side rope was failing, and a failing rope under load was a whip that could take a hand or an eye. Mara drew her knife and cut. The wagon's rear end swung sideways 6 inches and slammed down onto the lower crib stack with a sound like a door thrown shut by God. Dust exploded upward. Ephraim fell against the trench wall. Mara staggered on the ramp. Sari pressed herself flat against the earth. Silence. Then Ephraim laughed. It was a short, hard sound, more relief than humor. He put his hand on the wagon body. It was sitting in the trench, not level, tilted slightly toward the sump corner, but down, below grade, its roof 4 inches beneath the prairie surface. We lost the rope, Mara said. Ephraim nodded. We kept the wagon. He looked at Mara. She had cut the line without hesitation, the same principle he had taught about force and direction. When a line is failing, you do not fight it. You release it and redirect. She had learned. They spent the rest of the day leveling the wagon body on the trench floor, using wedges cut from cottonwood branches. Ephraim showed Mara how to check level with a cup of water set on the roof. If the water sat even, the roof was flat. They shimmed and wedged and checked until the water showed level in every direction. Then they began the ceiling. Sod went on first. Heavy, root-tangled blocks of prairie earth cut from the spoil pile and laid across the wagon roof in overlapping rows, the way shingles overlap, but thicker and heavier. Each block weighed as much as a newborn calf. Mara and Sari lifted them from the trench edge while Ephraim placed them, fitting the root masses together so the seams were tight. Then Clay went over the sod, the fat clay mixture that Clara had made possible, smeared into every gap, pressed flat, smoothed until the roof surface was continuous with the surrounding ground. The vent pipes were last. 2 lengths of salvage stovepipe bent at elbow angles, rising from holes cut in the wagon's end walls. They extended 8 inches above grade whilst no higher than a badger mound, just as Mara had designed. The elbows faced downwind so rain could not drive straight in. Ephraim packed clay around the pipe bases until the seal was airtight. When they finished, Mara climbed down the ramp and stood inside. The space was small. The wagon body's 11 feet 8 inches by 5 feet was enough for 6 people sitting, 4 people lying down, or a dozen standing if they pressed together like cattle in a pen. The air smelled of clay and wood and the faint ghost of patent medicine. Light entered only through the ramp entrance and the 2 vent pipes, which cast narrow columns of gray onto the floor. But the air moved. Mara lit a candle stub and held it near the east vent. The flame bent, pulled by the draft moving from the entrance, through the wagon body and out the vents. Air flowed. The shelter breathed. She poured a bucket of water at the entrance. It ran down the ramp, across the floor, and into the sump. The sump held it. She listened. Above, the wind was blowing, not hard, but steady, the constant prairie push that never fully stopped. Inside the wagon, the wind was a memory. The earth walls absorbed it. The sod roof smothered it. The sound that reached Mara's ears was not wind, but a low, rhythmic moan through the vent pipes, the voice of moving air being forced around a corner, slowed, and released. Toma climbed down the ramp, holding Sari's hand. He stood in the center of the wagon body and breathed. He did not cough. He breathed again and again. His chest rose and fell without the bark, without the rattle, without the spasm that had shaken him for weeks. The air inside was still and damp and warm from the earth that surrounded it. It was not medicine. It was shelter from the wind that had been drying his lungs and raking his throat every hour of every day since they had arrived. He looked at Mara. "It is quiet," he said. Mara put her hand on the wagon wall. The wood was cold but solid. The earth behind it pressed against her palm like something patient and very, very strong. The test came before the crisis. A 40-mile wind scoured the settlement the following afternoon. Not the razor wind, not the gale Mara feared, but a hard, sustained blow that sent dust rolling across the rooftops and made the frame cabins creak like ships at anchor. Loose tools skittered across the road. A tin sign tore from the mercantile's false front and cartwheeled into the grass. Mara sat inside the shelter with Toma and Sari. The dust rolled over the sod cap without entering. The vent pipes moaned but held. No grit reached the floor. No draft touched the candle flame except the gentle pull of the ventilation current. The sump was dry. The seams held. Toma slept. The first unbroken sleep he had managed in 3 weeks. When the wind dropped, Mara climbed out and found Ephraim sitting on the spoil pile, eating dried cornbread. "The roof did not shift," he said. I watched. Not a seam opened. This was not the test, Mara said. No, Ephraim said. This was not the test. Levi Rook walked past the shelter that evening and stopped. He looked at the rectangle of mud and sod that was, from the surface, nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. He crouched and pressed his palm to the sod cap. He pulled his hand away and looked at it. No dust, no grit. The surface was sealed. He said nothing. He walked back to town, but Mara saw him look over his shoulder twice. Vale's auction came and went. No one bid. The wagon was in a trench under 7 feet of earth, and removing it would require more effort and expense than the salvage was worth. Vale stood at the trench edge and stared down at the roof of the medicine wagon and understood that he had been outmaneuvered by a woman with a mattock and a horse. If anyone dies in your hole, Vale said, the town will call it murder. Mara was sealing a vent pipe joint with fresh clay. She did not look up. The razor wind gave 3 hours of warning. Mara felt it before she understood it. She woke before dawn because the prairie had gone completely silent. Not quiet. The plains were never quiet. There was always wind, always grass, always something moving. This was silence, the absence of sound so total that it had weight, like a hand pressed over the mouth of the world. She crawled up the ramp and stood at the entrance. The sky was black in the west, not the black of night, but a deeper black, a thickness in the air that swallowed starlight. The temperature had been dropping since midnight. She could feel the cold pressing down like a ceiling lowering. The grass did not move. The air did not move. Everything was held. Then the cattle shifted. On Brackett's claim, a quarter-mile south, the 2 cows began walking east, pressing against their fence line, pushing toward the creek bank where the ground dropped below the prairie surface. They were not running. They were not panicked. They moved with the deliberate urgency of animals who understood something that the humans around them had not yet processed. Birds were gone, not roosting. Gone. The fence post stood bare. Mara went to Ephraim's camp. He was already awake, sitting upright on his blanket, his hands on his knees. He had not slept. I can feel it in my chest, he said. The pressure, like before a barrage. It is coming, Mara said. Today. She went to every door in Ash Creek Crossing. She knocked. She told them. The razor wind was coming, not a gust, not a blow. A gale that would cross the prairie like a wall and flatten whatever stood in its path. Come to the shelter. Bring your children. Bring water. Come now. Most did not come. A woman knocking on doors before dawn, telling them the wind was going to destroy their homes. This was the same woman who had dug a grave and called it wisdom. This was superstition. This was fear dressed as knowledge. They closed their doors and went back to bed. Ansel Brackett did not go back to bed. He stood in his doorway and looked at the sky. He looked at his cows pressing the fence. He looked at Clara, who was 8 months pregnant and sleeping on her side with one hand on her belly. How long? He asked. Before noon, Mara said. Brackett closed his door. Mara walked on. The first blast hit at 10:30. It came from the northwest as a wall of pressure that preceded the wind itself. A shove of air compressed by the speed of what was behind it. The pressure change popped Mara's ears from inside the shelter. Thomas screamed. Then the wind arrived. The sound was not a whistle. It was not a howl. It was a continuous roar, like a saw blade the size of the sky being drawn across green wood that would not stop splitting. The pitch dropped and climbed without rhythm, without pause, without the gaps that normal wind provided, the moments of breath between gusts that let a person think, adjust, and brace. There were no gaps. The razor wind was one sustained exhalation that stretched from horizon to horizon and pressed against everything that rose above the ground. The first casualties were small. A loose board spun from the mercantile and shattered against a fence post. Tools left in the road became projectiles. A hammerhead skipped across the packed earth like a stone across water. Shingles peeled from Rook's newest cabin in sheets, rising and tumbling and shattering against anything solid they struck. Dust mixed with sand and ice crystals became a horizontal river at chest height, dense enough to obscure buildings at 30 yards. Mara sealed the shelter hatch and braced it with the interior timber. Ephraim checked the roof props, the 4 cottonwood posts, each one trimmed and wedged into place over the past week, stood firm. The sod cap took the pressure as weight, not force. Each gust pressed the earth downward, compressing it against the wagon roof, tightening the seal instead of breaking it. Inside, the roar was muffled to a deep, steady vibration that Mara felt in her sternum. The walls did not shake. They absorbed. The earth transmitted the sound as a hum, like standing inside a drum being struck from a great distance. Toma pressed against Mara's side. Sari sat with her back against the far wall, her hands flat on the floor, feeling the vibration. Ephraim crouched near the entrance ramp, listening. Then the first complication arrived as a scream through the hatch seal. Clara Brackett's voice, shredded by wind, barely human. Mara heard the word please and the word open and nothing else, because the wind took everything else. Ephraim moved toward the hatch. Mara caught his arm. Opening the hatch meant letting the wind into the shelter. Letting the wind into the shelter meant risking the seal on the vents, risking the candle, risking the stability of the sod cap that was holding because it was continuous and unbroken. Another scream. This one was not Clara's. It was a child's. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens next changes everything. Mara opened the hatch. The wind hit her face like a slap from a flat board. Grit drove into her eyes, her nostrils, the gaps between her teeth. She could not see. She reached into the roar and felt fabric, skin, hair. She pulled. Clara fell down the ramp and rolled against the wagon wall. She was holding her belly with both arms and gasping in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. Behind her, 2 children tumbled through the opening. Brackett's boy and girl, 5 and 3, screaming without sound because the wind swallowed everything. Ephraim hauled them clear of the ramp. Mara reached out again. She felt Ansel Brackett's hand, thick, calloused, shaking. She pulled. He came through the hatch on his knees, bleeding from a cut above his eye where something airborne had struck him on the run from his homestead. The hatch slammed shut. Mara drove the brace timber home. The seal held. Inside, 9 people now occupied a space built for 6. Clara was moaning. Her contractions had started, not from labor's natural timing, but from the shock of the run, the pressure change, the animal terror of the wind. Mara knelt beside her and placed one hand on her belly. The muscles were rigid. "Not yet," Mara said. "Not here. Hold." Clara's eyes were white-rimmed. She held. Outside, the destruction continued in the mechanical, impartial way that wind destroys. Levi Rook's south wall bowed inward as the wind found the unchinked seams, the same seams Mara had heard humming weeks earlier, and pressed through them. The boards flexed, held for 12 seconds, then tore away in a sequence that sounded like a volley of gunfire. Each board ripped free at its nails, spun once, and flew east. The wall did not collapse. It was peeled, layer by layer, like bark from a cottonwood. Vale's office lost its false front in a single gust. The facade, which was merely decorative, a flatboard wall nailed to a lower structure to make the building look taller from the road, caught the wind like a sail and ripped free at the roofline. It traveled 40 feet before breaking apart against the ground. Inside, papers and ledgers scattered through the gap where the wall had been, sucked out by the pressure differential and scattered across the prairie in a white storm of debts and deeds. On Brackett's claim, the fence gave way. The cows went through it, not because the wind lifted them. The wind did not lift cattle. The wind was not a tornado, but because the fence rails, driven by a gust that exceeded 70 miles per hour, broke at the post joints and became horizontal projectiles that struck the animals and drove them sideways into the broken wire beyond. One cow fell. The other ran blind into the grass and was not found for 2 days. Mara heard none of this from inside the shelter. What she heard was the hum of the earth walls, the moan of the vent pipes, Clara's breathing, and Toma's cough, which had returned with the crowding, the dust that had entered during the hatch opening, and the stress that tightened every chest in the space. Then a different sound, a pounding on the sod cap, not wind, a fist. Ephraim pressed his ear to the roof. "Someone is up there." Mara climbed the ramp and cracked the hatch. Grit blasted through the gap. Through the horizontal river of dust and ice, she saw 2 figures crawling across the ground, a man dragging himself by his elbows and a younger man pulling the first by his collar. The younger man was Orrin Pike, one of Rook's carpenter apprentices, 22 years old, with a face full of grit and blood running from both nostrils. The man he was dragging was Levi Rook. Rook's left leg was bent at an angle that no leg bends voluntarily. A timber, a piece of his own cabin's wall framing, had struck him as he tried to reach the schoolhouse. The bone was broken below the knee. Rook was conscious, but not speaking. His teeth were clenched so tightly that the tendons in his neck stood out like ropes. Mara did not hesitate. She grabbed Rook's collar from the other side and pulled. Ephraim came up the ramp and took Rook's weight across his shoulders, a lift that bent Ephraim nearly double and drove him to his knees on the ramp. Orrin Pike fell through the hatch behind them. 12 people, in a space 11 feet 8 inches long and 5 feet wide. Rook's leg needed setting. Mara had set bones before, not as a doctor, but as a woman who had lived in places where doctors did not exist. She straightened the leg while Ephraim held Rook's shoulders and Ansel held his hips. Rook screamed once, a sound that cut through the wind noise from outside like a blade through cloth. Then he went quiet. Mara splinted the leg with 2 flat boards torn from the shelter's interior and bound them with strips of Clara's petticoat. The shelter was full. The air was thickening. 12 people breathing in a sealed space consumed the available air faster than the 2 vent pipes could replace it. The candle flame, which had burned steadily since morning, began to gutter. Ephraim watched it the way a sailor watches a compass. When the flame shrank to a blue kernel and leaned hard toward the east vent, he said, "We are losing air." Mara checked the vents. The east pipe was clear. She could feel a thin draft when she held her hand over the opening. The west pipe was silent. No draft. No pull. Something had blocked it from outside. Wind-driven mud. A clod of wet earth and grass, compressed by the gale's pressure, had sealed the vent's exterior opening. The pipe was clogged. The air in the shelter had perhaps 30 minutes before the carbon from 12 pairs of lungs would make the space dangerous. Perhaps less. Mara did not have a clock. She had the candle flame, which was dying. She could not go outside. The wind would flatten her before she reached the vent pipe, and even if she reached it, clearing the blockage from the exterior meant standing upright in a gale that was throwing timber. "Sorry?" Mara said. Sari looked up. She was pressed between the wall and Brackett's sleeping daughter. The vent is clogged. You need to clear it from inside. The elbow is 3 feet from the wall. You can reach it with the wire. The wire was a length of fence wire Mara had bent into a hook for exactly this purpose, a tool designed for a problem she had anticipated but hoped would not arrive. The vent pipe was 6 inches in diameter. Only Sari's arm was thin enough to reach the elbow joint where the blockage sat. Sari took the wire. She crawled to the wall beneath the west vent. She reached up, fed the wire into the pipe opening, and pushed. The wire met resistance. She pushed harder. The wire bent. She adjusted the angle, hooked the blockage, and pulled. A plug of mud and grass dropped from the pipe onto the shelter floor. Cold air poured through the opening with a whistle that sounded in that moment like the most beautiful note Mara had ever heard. The candle flame rose. It straightened. It burned. Ephraim exhaled. Clara's breathing eased. Rook opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. The underside of a medicine wagon he had said could not hold earth, and said nothing. The razor wind lasted 9 hours. It did not die gradually. It stopped, the way a hand stops when it reaches the end of its swing. One moment the roar filled the earth walls like blood fills a vein. The next moment, silence. Not the loaded silence of the morning, when the air had held its breath. A flat, exhausted silence, like the world after a fever breaks. Mara opened the hatch at dawn. The light was gray and thin and carried no warmth. She climbed the ramp and stood on the prairie surface and looked at Ash Creek Crossing. Where cabins had stood, there were floors. The walls lay flat in one direction, east, like cards knocked from a table by a single sweep of a hand. Stoves sat exposed on their platforms, their pipes bent or missing. A bed frame stood upright in the middle of the road, driven into the packed earth by the wind like a fence post set by a madman. Shingles, boards, barrel staves, and fragments of furniture littered the ground in a pattern that told the story of the wind's direction as clearly as a compass needle. Rook's cabins were gone, not damaged. Gone. The frames he had built with Iowa joints and diagonal bracing and corner posts set 3 feet deep had been disassembled by the wind with the patience of a carpenter working in reverse, pulling each board free at its weakest nail and sending it east. Vale's office was a floor with a stove. The mercantile had lost its canvas north wall and its wooden south wall, leaving the goods inside exposed to the grit-filled air like organs laid open on a table. Mara's shelter was a rectangle of mud in the grass. The sod cap was intact. The vent pipes tilted slightly but stood. The ramp entrance was buried under a drift of grit and debris that Ephraim cleared with a shovel in 10 minutes. 12 people climbed out of the shelter one by one. Clara, still pregnant, still holding. Brackett's children blinking at the sky. Orrin Pike limping. Rook carried by Ephraim and Ansel, his splinted leg held straight, his face the color of ash. The sun came through the overcast and touched the exposed floors where homes had been. Rook sat in the grass beside the shelter entrance and placed his hand on the sod cap. He pressed. The surface did not yield. He ran his fingers along the seam where the clay met the earth. Sealed, unbroken. After 9 hours of wind that had pulled his cabins apart board by board, the mud roof above a buried medicine wagon did not have a single lifted edge. Rook looked at Mara. 12 people stood around them. His voice carried in the silence that followed the storm the way all voices carry in silence, clearly, with nowhere to hide. I built walls for the wind to hit, Rook said. She gave it nothing. The morning after the razor wind, Ash Creek Crossing counted what it had lost. 4 frame cabins were unlivable. The walls that remained stood at angles that made them more dangerous than the open air. A gust could finish what the gale had started, and leaning timber fell without warning. Vale's office had no front wall and no roof on its north half. The mercantile's south wall lay 50 yards east in the grass, its boards scattered like a hand of cards thrown by a poor loser. The schoolhouse roof had lifted at the ridge and settled crookedly, leaving a gap along the eaves wide enough to admit rain, wind, and every kind of vermin the prairie produced. Brackett's fence was matchwood. One cow was dead, its ribs broken by a rail that had struck it broadside at a speed that bent the iron brace at impact. Mara's buried wagon shelter held 12 people through a 9-hour gale and released them into the morning with dry bedding, intact walls, functioning vents, and a sump that had collected exactly the amount of water it was designed to collect and no more. The candle had burned through the night. Clara Brackett had not delivered. Rook's leg, though broken, had been set clean enough that he would walk again by spring. Toma's cough had eased in the still, damp air below ground. Orrin Pike's bruised ribs were painful, but not punctured. These were not stories. These were measurements, and measurements, unlike arguments, did not require anyone's permission to be true. Rook's conversion happened in public because he chose it that way. 3 days after the gale, when the settlement was still clearing debris and nailing salvaged boards over the gaps in whatever walls still stood, Rook asked Mara to walk the shelter with him. His leg was splinted, and he moved on a crutch Ephraim had carved from a cottonwood limb, but he moved. He lowered himself down the ramp with the careful dignity of a man determined not to be carried into the place that had saved his life. Inside, he did what carpenters do. He touched everything. He pressed his palm against the wagon wall and felt the earth packed behind it. He tapped the roof and listened to the sound. Not the ring of hollow timber, but the flat thud of wood backed by 4 inches of sod and clay. He crouched, badly, and sighted along the floor grade toward the sump. He examined the center props and traced the load lines with his finger, following the weight from the sod cap through the wagon roof, through the props, into the trench floor. He stood. It took him a long time, and Ephraim did not offer help, and Rook did not ask for it. "The props are carrying the load into the floor," Rook said, "not into the walls. The walls are not structural. They're containment." "Yes," Mara said. "The roof does not need to be strong enough to hold the earth. It only needs to be strong enough to transfer the weight to the props, and the props transfer it to the ground." "Yes." "And the earth on top does not weaken the roof. It strengthens the seal. The heavier the cap, the tighter the surface, the less wind can find." "Yes." Rook was quiet. He looked at the painted slogan on the interior wall. "Dr. Bell's tonic cures what ails you." Barely visible in the candlelight, the letters dark with months of soot and condensation. "I have been building houses the way I was taught in Iowa," Rook said. 4 walls, corner posts, a pitched roof. A house stands up and the wind hits it, and the house fights the wind. Every joint is a battle. Every board is a surface the wind can grab. He paused. "You did not build a house. You remove the battle. You put the shelter where the wind cannot reach it. The wind passes over. There's no fight because there is nothing to fight against." He said this in the doorway of the shelter, which meant he said it on the ramp, which meant his voice carried up and out into the open air, where Ansel Brackett and Clara and Orrin Pike and 4 other settlers had gathered, not by invitation, but by the gravity that pulls people toward moments they sense are important. "I built walls for the wind to hit," Rook said again, louder this time, speaking to the people above as much as to Mara below. She gave it nothing to hit. She was right. I was wrong, and every person who spent last night under a broken roof instead of under the ground has me to blame for it as much as the wind." Nobody spoke. The wind, the ordinary, constant, tolerable wind that was not the razor wind but was still the wind of the Nebraska prairie, moved through the grass above them and made the sound it always made, which was the sound of something that would always be there and could not be beaten, only avoided. The questions came within the week, not all at once, and not from everyone, but in the particular trickle of a community that has been frightened badly enough to reconsider what it knows. A homesteader's wife named Dagna Flaten, Norwegian, quiet, built like the plow horse she drove, appeared at the shelter entrance and asked Mara how deep the trench needed to be for a family of 5. Mara did not answer with a number. She asked how tall the tallest family member was, how much timber they could salvage, and whether their claim had a slope or sat flat. "Every shelter is different," Mara said. "The ground tells you what it can hold. You listen to the ground the way you listen to a horse, not with words but with weight." Dagna did not understand. Mara showed her. She walked to a patch of undisturbed prairie, drove a stake into the earth, and pulled it out. The hole was clean-edged, the soil dark and cohesive. "This ground holds itself," Mara said. She walked 20 paces north, drove the stake again. This time the hole crumbled at the edges. "This ground does not. You dig here, your walls cave. You dig there, your walls stand. The trench goes where the ground is strong." Dagna nodded. She asked about water. Mara showed her the sump. She asked about air. Mara lit a candle and held it near the vent. She asked about fire. Mara pointed to the clay-lined firebox Ephraim had built against the far wall, a shallow pit with a stone surround and a pipe that connected to the east vent, drawing smoke upward and out. "You will need to come back," Mara said. "You will need to dig. I will not dig for you, but I will show you where and how deep." Dagna came back the next day with her husband and a shovel. Orrin Pike came next. His ribs had healed enough to swing a mattock, and his loyalty had shifted from Rook's carpentry to Mara's method with the totality that young men bring to conversions. He asked questions with the eagerness of an apprentice and the muscle memory of a man who had spent 2 years driving nails. Mara put him to work cutting sod blocks and showed him how the root structure of prairie grass held the blocks together, natural reinforcement that no milled board could match. Ansel Brackett did not ask questions. He arrived with Clara and their children and a wagon loaded with fence rails and said, "Show me where to dig." His conversion was complete. It had happened not at the moment he helped lower the wagon, not at the moment he dug the ramp in the dark, but at the moment during the gale when he had looked at his pregnant wife crouched in an underground shelter built by the woman the town had called a gravedigger and understood that Clara was alive because Mara had been right and the settlement had been wrong. The arithmetic was simple. The town's 4 cabins had failed. Mara's buried wagon had held. Everything else was opinion. Clara's contribution was precise and practical. She asked about the side bench Mara had mentioned, a raised platform inside the shelter where a woman could lie during childbirth, high enough to stay dry if the sump overflowed. Mara designed it that afternoon, a frame of cottonwood poles, a surface of salvaged boards, a height of 14 inches above the floor. Clara sat on it, tested the width, and said, 2 inches wider. A woman in labor does not hold still. Mara widened it by 2 inches. Milton Vale did not convert, he adapted. His first response to the shelter's success was denial packaged as caution. At the mercantile stove, 3 days after the gale, he told the remaining settlers that the shelter had worked by luck. The gale had been bad, he said, but not the worst the plains could produce. A true storm, a tornado, A blizzard with drifting snow would bury the shelter's entrance and suffocate everyone inside. The design was a trap, not a solution. Building underground was a retreat from civilization, not an advance toward it. The argument had teeth. Vale was not stupid, and his objections were not entirely wrong. A shelter entrance could drift over. A sump could fail in sustained rain. An underground space with too many bodies and too few vents could become a death chamber. These were real risks, and Mara knew it, and Vale knew she knew it, and the settlers knew it too. But Vale overplayed his hand. He stood in the mercantile with no front wall on his own office, speaking to people whose cabins were flattened, telling them the shelter that had saved 12 lives was a death trap. The disconnect between his words and the evidence scattered across the prairie around him was visible to everyone. People listened. People did not laugh with him. And that silence, the absence of the laughter that had carried his mockery for weeks, was the first sign that his authority was cracking. He tried a different angle. He told settlers that if they wanted to build underground, they needed proper materials: milled lumber for roof beams, iron hardware for vent assemblies, treated canvas for waterproofing, materials he could sell, at credit rates that would keep families indebted for the same 2 winters his original lumber scheme had demanded. The shelter had not eliminated his leverage. It had merely forced him to redirect it. Mara undercut him without effort. She built with salvage, sod, cottonwood, clay, and rendered fat. She taught others to do the same. Every shelter that went into the ground using free materials was a sale Vale did not make, a debt he could not collect, a family he could not control. His hold over Ash Creek Crossing depended on the settlers needing what only he sold, and Mara was proving, trench by trench, that what the settlers truly needed was already under their feet. The mentor relationship between Mara and Ephraim deepened in the weeks after the Gale, not through conversation, but through shared labor. They built the second shelter together, a proper design, not an emergency burial of a medicine wagon, but a planned, measured, purpose-built earth shelter on the bracket claim. Ephraim taught Mara the carpentry she lacked. Mara taught Ephraim the earthwork he had never formally learned. Their disagreements were technical and genuine. Ephraim wanted the roof beams closer together, every 18 inches, because he had seen timber fail under snow load during the war and trusted redundancy over strength. Mara wanted the beams wider apart, every 24 inches, because each beam required timber, and timber on the treeless prairie was the scarcest material they had. Every beam used for the roof was a beam not available for props, entry framing, or the next family's shelter. They argued beside the bracket trench while Ansel, Doug, and Clara mixed clay. 18 inches, Ephraim said. I have seen a beam break under load, and when it breaks, the beam beside it catches what the broken one drops. If the beams are too far apart, the next beam cannot reach. If we use every beam at 18 inches, Mara said, the Flatin family has no roof beams at all. We have 5 families asking. We have timber for perhaps 3 shelters. Every 6 inches of spacing you add costs half a shelter for someone else. Ephraim was quiet. The math was not engineering. It was triage. It was the kind of calculation Mara had been making her entire life. Not how much is ideal, but how little is enough. They compromised. 20 inches. Close enough to catch a failed beam. Wide enough to stretch the timber supply to 4 shelters instead of 3. The compromise taught both of them something. Ephraim learned that building for a community was not the same as building for a contract. The resource was shared, and the design had to account for everyone, not just the structure in front of you. Mara learned that her instinct to minimize was sometimes its own risk, that the margin between enough and not enough was thinner than she wanted to believe, and that a single failed beam could kill as surely as no shelter at all. They sat inside the bracket shelter after the roof was sealed, listening to the drips fall into the sump, a sound that had become, for both of them, the sound of something working, water going where it was told, force going where it was directed, the earth doing what the earth had always done, which was hold. I survived a night under a wagon once, Ephraim said. Not this wagon. An army freight wagon outside Petersburg, winter of '64. The shelling started after dark and did not stop until morning. I lay under the wagon bed and listened to the iron pass overhead and hit the earth around me, and I thought, if I live through this, I will never sleep above ground again. Mara did not ask whether he had kept that promise. She could see the answer in his blankets, which were always on the ground, never on a raised bed, in his posture, which curved toward the earth the way a man curves toward the thing that once saved him. Earth remembers weight better than men remember warnings, Mara said. Ephraim looked at her in the candlelight. The painted slogan on the far wall was invisible in the shadow, but they both knew it was there. Dr. Bell's tonic cures what ails you. The wagon that had never cured anyone was now the core of a shelter that had saved 12 lives, and the man whose name it bore by accident was the man who had made the lowering possible. That is true, Ephraim said, and it is the saddest true thing I know. They did not speak again that evening. The drips fell. The vent moaned. The earth held. Ephraim's war injury came back the way old injuries do. Not suddenly, but in stages, each stage a little worse than the last, each stage a little harder to ignore. The cold after the gale settled into his left hip, where a wagon tongue had struck him during a river crossing in '63. The joint stiffened. He limped. The limp became a halt. The halt became a day spent sitting on the spoil pile, unable to lower himself into the trench without hands bracing against both walls. He continued teaching. He sat at the trench edge and directed. He told Orrin Pike where to position the roof beams and how to check the fit by sighting along the grain. He told Dagna Flatten's husband how to build a crib under a heavy lintel stone. He told Ansel Brackett how to splice a rope using the long splice that had held during the wagon lowering and would hold again. But he could not demonstrate. The hands that had driven axle pins and lifted wagon bodies and tied the bridle hitch that Rook had designed, those hands still worked. The body that carried them to the work no longer could. The cold deepened in November. Ephraim's cough started on the third day of the month, a sound that Mara recognized immediately because she had been listening to Toma's version of it for weeks. Wet, deep, rooted in the chest like something growing. She made him mullein tea. He drank it. The cough eased for an hour. Then it returned, and the cycle began again. The same cycle Toma had lived through, except Ephraim was 58 years old and carried a decade of war damage in his lungs and joints, and the margin between recovery and decline was thinner for him than it was for a 7-year-old boy. He moved into the original wagon shelter. Mara insisted. The still air and steady warmth of the underground space eased his breathing the way it had eased Toma's. He slept below grade and woke each morning with enough strength to sit at the trench edge and teach for a few hours before the cold drove him back down. On the last day he taught, he gave Mara his block and tackle. The assembly was heavy, iron sheaves, hemp rope, oak housing. It had traveled with him since the war. It had lowered cannon, raised bridge timbers, and dropped a medicine wagon into a Nebraska trench. It was the most valuable thing he owned, and he placed it in Mara's hands the way a man places something in the hands of the person he trusts to use it. "You will not need my hands," Ephraim said. "You know where the weight goes now." Mara held the block and tackle and felt its weight, and understood that Ephraim was not giving her a tool. He was giving her permission to continue without him. The weight of iron and rope in her hands was the weight of his confidence in what she had learned, transferred from his body to hers in the simplest possible way by letting go. Ephraim Bell died on the 11th of November, 1874. He died underground in the shelter he had helped build. On the floor he had leveled with a cup of water. Beneath the roof he had lowered with his own strength and Mara's will. Sari was beside him. Toma was sleeping. Mara was holding his hand, which was cold and dry and still, and outside the vent pipes the wind blew, and the earth held, and the drips fell into the sump in a rhythm that did not stop because one man's heart had. They buried him on the creek rise, near the cairn that marked Mara's daughter's grave. Sari carried stones. Toma, whose cough had finally eased, and whose cheeks had begun to fill again, placed the last stone. Mara did not speak over the grave. She stood with one hand resting on the block and tackle that hung from her belt, and looked at the sky and knew the wind's direction before the grass bent. The secondary crisis arrived in the spring of 1875, and it arrived wearing the face of a sky turned black-green at 2 in the afternoon. The children were in the schoolhouse, 14 of them, ranging from Toma's age to a girl of 15 who helped the school teacher manage the younger ones. The communal shelter beneath the schoolhouse, the one Rook had asked Mara to help design months earlier, was half finished. Vale had delayed the project by arguing over land rights, construction fees, and who would be responsible if the shelter failed. His objections had consumed weeks. The trench was dug, the walls were shored, but the roof was open. 3 beams were in place, 9 were not. The shelter was a hole in the ground with no cover, as useful as a boat without a hull. The sky changed in 20 minutes. Clear to gray to green-black, the color of deep water in a lake where the bottom drops away. The temperature fell. Birds scattered east in a line so straight it looked planned. Mara felt the pressure change in her ears before she saw the cloud. She ran. 63 years old, hips aching, lungs working hard in the spring air, she ran from the wagon shelter to the schoolhouse, 300 yards across open ground, and arrived as the first gust hit the building's damaged roof. The children were standing in the aisles. The school teacher, a young man from Ohio named Everett Koss, had frozen. He was gripping the edge of his desk with both hands and staring at the window, where the glass was vibrating in its frame like a drumhead. He had never seen weather like this. He did not know what to do. Mara did. "Into the trench," she said. "All of you. Now." Koss looked at her. "The trench has no roof." "I know," Mara said. "Move." She herded 14 children down the schoolhouse steps and into the unfinished trench. The walls were 7 feet high. The children were below grade. The wind, when it arrived in full, would pass over them the way it passed over every sunken shelter Mara had built. But without a roof, rain and debris would fall in, and the 3 beams that spanned the trench were not enough to support a cover. Mara looked at the beams. She looked at the block and tackle on her belt. She looked at the schoolhouse's front wall, where a heavy lintel beam, 16 feet of milled pine, the best timber in the settlement, spanned the doorway. Rook had built that lintel. Rook, who was still on a crutch, appeared at the trench edge and saw what Mara was looking at. "That beam is load-bearing," he said. "If you pull it, the front wall comes down." "The front wall is coming down anyway," Mara said. The schoolhouse was already shaking. The damaged roof was lifting at the ridge the way it had lifted during the October gale, and this time the damage from the first storm had weakened every joint. The building would not stand through another sustained wind. Mara rigged the block and tackle to the lintel beam's east end. She looped the pull rope around a stump anchor 20 feet from the building. She called to Orrin Pike, who had appeared from somewhere. Pike was always appearing from somewhere when there was work to do, and together they pulled. The lintel beam resisted. It was nailed and pegged and seated in mortises that Rook had cut with a carpenter's precision. The nails screamed as they drew from the wood. The pegs snapped. The beam shifted, tilted, and dropped free from the wall with a sound like a tree cracking at its base. The front wall sagged but did not fall. Not yet. Mara and Pike dragged the beam to the trench edge. It was too heavy for 2 people. It was too heavy for 4. But the block and tackle changed the math the way Ephraim had taught her. Force redirected, friction managed, the load broken into increments that muscle could handle. They slid the beam across the trench opening and dropped it onto the shoring walls with a thud that shook the dirt from the trench sides and made 3 children scream. One beam was not a roof, but one beam plus the 3 already in place gave them 4 spans across the opening. Mara threw every piece of loose material she could find across the beams. Salvaged boards, a classroom bench, the schoolhouse door ripped from its hinges. The cover was ragged, incomplete, full of gaps. But it broke the vertical line. Debris falling from above would strike the cover first and deflect instead of hitting children. She wedged the lintel beam into position using a broken wagon spoke as a shim, the exact technique Ephraim had demonstrated during the original shelter construction, the technique she had watched his hands perform and stored in her own. The shim locked the beam against lateral movement. The beam became structural. The storm hit. Not the razor wind, not that broad, sustained wall of force, but a violent thunderstorm with gusts that exceeded 50 miles per hour and rain that fell sideways with enough force to sting exposed skin. The schoolhouse's front wall collapsed inward 30 seconds after the children cleared the building. The roof followed, folding along the damaged ridge and dropping into the interior in a cascade of shingles, rafters, and splintered pine. In the trench, the children were wet. They were frightened. 3 of them were crying. But the makeshift cover deflected the largest debris, and the trench walls blocked the wind, and the water ran to the low corner where someone, Mara did not see who, had already begun digging a crude sump with their hands. The storm lasted 40 minutes. When it passed, Mara climbed out and found Ansel Brackett standing in the rain beside the collapsed schoolhouse, looking at the trench where his children sat, alive, beneath a roof that a 63-year-old woman had assembled from a stolen lintel beam and a dead man's block and tackle in less time than it took the storm to arrive. Brackett said, "My family will dig first and build walls second from now on." He said it loud enough for the 12 adults who had gathered to hear. He said it looking at Mara, and he said it in the tone of a man who was not making a promise, but stating a fact that had become so obvious it embarrassed him to have ever thought otherwise. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Vale made his final play 3 days after the schoolhouse storm. He appeared at the Mercantile with a sheet of paper he called a storm cellar plan. It was a drawing, neat, measured, annotated with dimensions and material specifications, of an underground shelter that looked remarkably similar to Mara's design. The trench was the same depth. The sump was in the same corner. The vent placement matched. The only differences were cosmetic: milled lumber instead of salvage, iron hardware instead of rope, a plank door instead of a canvas flap. He offered to sell the plan for $3. He offered to sell the materials at his standard credit rate. He offered to supervise the construction for a fee. He was selling Mara's work back to the people she had taught for free. Mara did not argue. She did not confront Vale in the Mercantile or challenge his drawing or demand credit. She did something simpler and more devastating. She walked to the center of the settlement on Sunday afternoon, sat on a stump, and invited anyone who wanted to learn to dig a shelter to sit with her. 11 people came. She taught for 3 hours. She drew the trench dimensions in the dirt. She explained the sump, the grade, the vent angles, the sod cap, the fat clay seam mixture. She answered every question. She demonstrated the block and tackle for anyone strong enough to pull. She sent each person home with a set of measurements scratched onto a flat piece of cottonwood bark, their shelter's dimensions calculated for their claimed soil, their family's size, and the timber they had available. She charged nothing. She accepted nothing. When Dagna Flatten tried to pay her with a basket of eggs, Mara ate 2, gave the rest back, and said, "Teach someone else what I taught you. That is payment." Vale stood beside his stack of unsold lumber and watched the line of settlers with shovels walk past his mercantile toward the edge of town where Mara sat on her stump. The lumber had cost him freight from Omaha. The credit notes in his ledger represented months of leverage, and a woman with a stick and a piece of bark was dismantling his business model by giving away what he had tried to sell. He did not speak to Mara that afternoon. He watched. And the watching, for a man who had always controlled the terms of every transaction in Ash Creek Crossing, was its own kind of defeat. By the first week of December, the prairie around Ash Creek Crossing had begun to change in ways that a stranger passing through might not have noticed, but that anyone who had lived through the October gale would recognize immediately. The changes were in the ground. Where there had been flat, unbroken grass, there were now low rectangles of disturbed earth, some freshly dug, the clay still dark and wet, others already sealed with sod caps that had begun to knit into the surrounding prairie. Each rectangle marked a family. Each family had dug under Mara's direction, following measurements scratched onto cottonwood bark, adapted to their claimed soil and their household size. The shelters were not identical. The bracket shelter was wider than the flattened shelter because Clara needed room for a birthing bench and 2 children who did not sleep still. The pike shelter was deeper because Orrin had dug into clay that held itself and allowed a full 7 feet of headroom. The Coss shelter, Everett Coss, the school teacher, had committed to the method after the schoolhouse collapsed around his desk, was narrow but long, designed to double as a classroom in the worst weather, with a bench along each wall and a writing surface that hinged from the ceiling beams. Each shelter had a sump in the lowest corner. Each had 2 vent pipes angled against the prevailing wind. Each had a fat clay seal on every seam. Each had roof beams spaced at 20 inches. Mara and Ephraim's compromise, the distance that balanced structural safety against the timber supply. Each had a low entrance ramp on the east side, graded shallow enough to carry a child in the dark. Mara inspected everyone. She crawled every floor on her hands and knees, feeling for the grade, pouring water at the high end and watching it run. She checked every vent by holding a candle to the opening and watching the flame bend. She sat inside each completed shelter in silence for 5 minutes, listening to the walls, the roof, the sound of wind passing over without entering. If a seam leaked, she made the family redo it. If a vent moaned too loudly, a sign the angle was wrong and wind was entering instead of passing, she adjusted the elbow with a hammer and a piece of flat iron until the moan became a whisper. She did not soften her standards for anyone. When Dagna Flatten's husband cut his sump too shallow, Mara handed him the mattock and said, "Deeper." When he complained that the clay was hard, she said, "The water does not care that the clay is hard. Deeper." He dug deeper. The sump held through 3 rains without overflowing. When Orrin Pike placed his roof beams at 24 inches instead of 20 to save timber, Mara stood beneath the widest span and pressed upward with both hands. The beam flexed. Not much, not dangerously. but enough that Mara could feel the give in her palms, and she looked at Pike with an expression that needed no words. Ephraim said 18, Pike said. Ephraim and I agreed on 20, Mara said. 20 is the number, not 24, not 22. 20. Pike moved the beams. He did not argue. He had seen what happened to structures built by men who trusted their judgment over the judgment of people who had lived through what those structures were meant to survive. Levi Rook became an unlikely collaborator. His broken leg healed slowly through the winter, and the enforced stillness gave him time to think in ways that active men rarely allow themselves. He sat in his half-rebuilt cabin, which now had diagonal bracing, chinked seams, and a lower roofline he had redesigned after studying the way Mara's shelter deflected wind, and drew plans in a carpenter's notebook. The plans were hybrid designs. Rook could not abandon framing entirely. It was his trade, his identity, the skill that gave him value in a settlement that needed buildings above ground as much as it needed shelters below. But he could adapt. He drew cabins with reinforced connections at every joint. He drew roof lines pitched lower, offering less surface to the wind. He drew foundation cellars that served as storm shelters, accessible through a hatch in the cabin floor, the above-ground structure for daily life, the below-ground structure for survival. He brought the drawings to Mara on a January afternoon, limping through the snow on his mended leg, and spread them on the floor of the wagon shelter. Your method and mine, he said. Together. Mara studied the drawings. She pointed to the cellar dimensions. The sump is on the wrong side. Water flows south on this claim. Put the sump in the southeast corner. Rook made the correction. He did not bristle. He did not defend his original placement. He changed it because the woman who had taught him where water goes had earned the authority to say where a sump belonged. The vent angles are too steep, Mara said. Wind will drive rain straight down at this pitch. Flatten the elbow by 10 degrees. Rook flattened the elbow. The entry hatch, Mara said. It opens upward. In a gale, the wind will grab it. It should open downward, into the cellar. The weight holds it shut. You lift against gravity to open, not against wind. Rook redesigned the hatch. He looked at the corrected drawing and then at Mara, and on his face was the expression of a man who has spent his career believing he understood buildings and has just discovered an entire category of knowledge he did not know existed. I will put your name on the first page, Rook said. These are your measurements, your method. Mara shook her head. Put them on the buildings. That is where they belong. The winter tested the shelters in the ways that Vale had predicted and Mara had prepared for. A blizzard in mid-January dropped 2 feet of snow in 14 hours and drifted it against every vertical surface on the prairie. The shelter entrances, which faced east and sat below grade, collected drifts that blocked the ramps. Families who had followed Mara's instruction, keep a shovel inside, always, cleared the drifts from below, pushing the snow up and out the ramp in 20 minutes. Families who had not kept a shovel inside spent 2 hours digging from above, learning the lesson the hard way. The cold that followed the blizzard was the deep kind, the kind that settled and stayed. 22 degrees below zero for 3 consecutive nights. The frame cabins, even Rook's improved designs, burned fuel at rates that drained wood piles and left families huddled around stoves that could not keep the far corners of a room above freezing. The earth shelters did not freeze. The ground surrounding them held a constant temperature, not warm, but above freezing. 40 degrees inside when the air outside was 20 below. The difference was survival. A family in a shelter burned 1/3 the firewood of a family in a cabin because the earth did the insulating that the walls could not. Mara tracked the numbers. 8 families in shelters used a combined total of 14 cords of wood through January. 6 families in cabins used 31. The difference was not a calculation she performed for argument. It was a fact she observed by counting the wood piles and asking. Clara Brackett delivered her baby in the shelter Mara had designed. On the bench Mara had widened by 2 inches at Clara's request in the first week of February. The birth was attended by Mara, who served as midwife, a role she had performed dozens of times over decades in communities that had no access to physicians. The shelter was warm, still, and private. The vent pipes drew the smoke from the firebox upward and out. The sump caught the water Clara's labor produced and held it. The baby was a girl. Clara named her Beret, after her grandmother, the one who had sealed a cellar floor in Ohio with tallow and clay. Mara held the baby and felt the small weight and the heat of new blood and the grip of fingers that had never touched wind. The wagon shelter was full of sounds. The baby's first cries, Clara's exhausted breathing, Ansel's voice saying something to his older children that Mara did not catch because she was listening to the drips falling into the sump, water going where it was told. The same sound. Always the same sound. The hostile skeptic's reckoning arrived not through confrontation, but through weather, which was the only judge on the prairie that could not be bribed, delayed, or argued with. A late-season windstorm struck in March, Doi, not as severe as the October razor wind, but strong enough to test every structure in the settlement. Gusts exceeded 50 miles per hour for 6 hours. The frame cabins, rebuilt and improved by Rook, held. Their lower roof lines and reinforced joints performed as designed. The earth shelters held as they had always held, their sod caps flush with the ground, the wind passing over them like water over a stone. Vale's office did not hold. He had rebuilt it after the October gale using his own lumber stock, and he had rebuilt it to look prosperous. A false front restored, a plank floor refinished, a sign repainted. He had not lowered the roof line. He had not reinforced the joints. He had not chinked the seams with the care that Rook now demanded of every structure he touched. He had built it the way it had looked before, because appearance was Vale's currency and he could not afford to look diminished. The March wind found the unchinked seams on the west wall and pressed through them. The false front caught the gust at its full width and transferred the force into the roof line, where the nails, wazia, driven into wood that had already been stressed and loosened by the October gale, began to withdraw. The roof lifted, not far, 2 inches. But 2 inches was enough for the wind to get beneath it, and once the wind was beneath the roof was no longer shelter. It was a sail attached to 4 walls that did not want to be a mast. Vale was inside when the roof lifted. He heard the nails scream. He felt the pressure change as the ceiling separated from the walls. He had time to reach the door, the same front door that faced the wind, the same door that opened outward into the gust. He could not open it. The wind held it shut with more force than his arms could overcome. He broke the back window with a chair and climbed through. The glass cut his forearm. He stumbled across the lot behind his office and looked for shelter. The nearest shelter was the schoolhouse trench, the communal storm cellar that Mara had designed, that Rook had helped build, that Vale had delayed for months with arguments about land rights and fees and responsibility, the shelter that existed despite him. Vale ran for it. The wind knocked him sideways. He fell, rose, fell again. Levi Rook, who had been heading for the same shelter, saw him from 20 yards and did not hesitate. Rook was still limping. His mended leg ached in every storm. But he reached Vale, grabbed the man's collar, and pulled him upright. Ansel Brackett appeared from the other direction, took Vale's other arm, and the three of them staggered into the trench and down the ramp as the wind stripped the last of Vale's false front from the building behind them and sent it spinning east across the prairie. Inside the shelter, Vale sat on the bench that Clara had requested widened. His arm bled onto his trousers. His hands shook. 14 people were in the shelter, the same number of children who had been saved in the unfinished trench the previous spring, plus adults who had learned to move underground when the sky changed color. Nobody spoke to Vale. Not unkindly, not pointedly. They simply did not address him the way people do not address a man who has arrived at a truth everyone else reached months ago. The silence was not punishment. It was the absence of anything that needed saying. When the wind stopped, Vale climbed out of the trench and looked at his office. The roof had landed 40 feet east. The false front was gone. His ledgers were scattered in the mud. Rook was standing beside him. "A grave keeps the dead," Vale said. His voice was flat. His eyes were on the place where his office had been. That hole kept the living. It was not an apology. It was not a conversion. It was an admission, extracted not by argument, but by the wind, which did not care about Vale's business model or his pride or his need to control the terms of every transaction. The wind cared about surfaces. Vale had given it surfaces. Mara had not. The arithmetic was finished. By the end of that first year, Mara's authority in Ash Creek Crossing was no longer sentimental. It was operational. When new settlers arrived, and they arrived through the spring and summer of 1875 in a steady trickle, drawn by the Homestead Act's promise and the railroad's proximity, Levi Rook met them first. He showed them his cabins, his improved designs, his hybrid plans with foundation cellars, and then he sent them to Mara. "Talk to her before you buy boards from anyone," he said. He said it in front of Vale, whose lumber sat stacked beside the rebuilt mercantile, and the saying of it in front of Vale was its own statement about whose authority now governed the settlement's relationship with the sky. Mara did not turn new settlers away. She did not charge. She did not lecture. She walked their claims with them, drove stakes, tested soil, and drew measurements on bark. She asked how many children they had, how much timber they could salvage, and whether anyone in the family had a bad chest. She designed each shelter for the family that would use it, because a shelter was not a product to be sold from a plan. It was an answer to a specific question asked by a specific piece of ground for a specific group of people. By the third winter, 11 family shelters and one communal schoolhouse refuge existed within 2 miles of Ash Creek Crossing. Each had a low entrance, a drainage sump, clay-packed seams, and a roof load calculated by hand and experience. Each had been inspected by Mara. Each had been tested by weather. Each had held. The original medicine wagon shelter remained at the settlement's eastern edge, its sod cap thick with grass that had rooted through 2 growing seasons until the surface was indistinguishable from the prairie around it. Children played on the rectangle of earth above the wagon body and were told not to jump on it. The wagon's painted slogan, "Dr. Bell's Tonic Cures What Ails You," was still legible on the interior wall, though the letters were dark with years of candle soot and the condensation of breath from every person who had sheltered there. Children traced the letters with their fingers and laughed because the wagon that had sold colored water to sick people had finally cured something. It had cured the town's belief that the only way to survive was to stand up and fight the wind. Mara did not become famous. Her name did not appear in newspapers. No photographer came from Omaha to capture her image beside the wagon shelter. No government surveyor recorded her method in a report that would be filed in Washington and forgotten in a drawer. Her knowledge spread the way knowledge had always spread among the people she came from, through hands, through labor, through the act of showing someone how to do a thing and then watching them do it. Dagna Flatten taught her neighbor, Orrin Pike taught 2 homesteaders on the next creek south. Clara Brackett, who had learned to seal seams with fat clay mixture before she had learned to seal them with anything else, taught every new mother who arrived at Ash Creek Crossing with a husband, a wagon, and no idea that the first thing to build was not a house, but a hole. Sari grew into the work the way a tree grows into the light it finds. By 14, she was digging trenches alongside men twice her age and correcting their sump angles with the same flat tone her grandmother used. By 16, she was delivering babies in shelters she had helped build, combining Mara's knowledge of earth construction with the midwifery she had learned by watching Mara's hands during Clara's delivery and every delivery after. She became the person families sent for when 2 things happened at once: when a baby was coming and the sky was changing, because she knew how to manage both. Toma survived his cough. The winter air inside the wagon shelter had eased his lungs enough to let his body fight, and by spring his chest was clear and his appetite had returned. He grew into a quiet boy who became a quiet man, and his particular skill was vent pipes. He understood airflow the way Mara understood wind, not from theory, but from a childhood spent breathing in a space where the air moved because someone had designed it to move. He repaired vent elbows for neighbors, adjusted angles, cleared blockages. He kept the shelters breathing the way his grandmother had kept him breathing through his first Nebraska winter. Rook's carpenter notebook survived longer than most of the structures it described. He kept it for 20 years, filling it with measurements, corrections, and hybrid designs that evolved as the settlement grew. On the first page, despite Mara's refusal, he had written her name, not as a dedication, as a heading. The measurements that followed were hers, and Rook was honest enough and changed enough to say so on paper, even if she would not say so herself. Mara lived out her later years at the edge of Ash Creek Crossing, in a low-profile earth shelter she had built herself on a piece of ground that no one had claimed because it was too close to the creek and too far from the road. She chose it because it sat at the settlement's western margin, close enough to hear the church bell that had been hung in 1877, but far enough that she could see the weather coming before town dust hit it. She raised Sari and Toma. She taught women how to seal clay seams with the fat clay mixture Clara had first brought in 2 buckets at dusk. She refused payment beyond food, rope, or help with digging. When someone offered money, she asked them to spend it on timber for a neighbor's roof beams instead. When someone offered thanks, she handed them a mattock. She grew older. Her eyes dimmed. Her hands, which had split open on the mattock handle and sealed shut with clay, and opened again more times than she could count, stiffened in the cold and ached in the damp. But she could still feel the wind's direction on her skin before the grass bent, and she could still press her palm to an earth wall and know, by the vibration or the stillness, whether the structure behind it would hold. She sat at her shelter entrance on the mornings when the air tasted of distance and metal, and watched the sky for the color she had learned to read before she learned to read anything written on paper. Sometimes the color came. Sometimes it did not. But the shelters were in the ground, and the sumps were dug, and the vents were angled, and the children who played on the sod caps above the buried wagons and timbers did not know they were standing on the roofs of the rooms that had kept their parents alive. They did not need to know. That was the point. Survival knowledge that worked did not require belief. It required only the willingness to dig. Years later, after another gale had crossed the prairie and passed over the low rectangles of earth without finding anything to seize, Mara sat at the entrance of the original wagon shelter with one palm on the sod cap. She was nearly blind by then. The grass moved around her in waves she could feel but not see. Children played somewhere to the east, their voices carried on the wind the way the wind carried everything, without preference, without mercy, without stopping. She heard the grass shift direction before the children felt it. She turned her face into the new wind and knew its source and its speed and its intention the way she had known these things for 70 years, the way her mother had known them, the way the women who built and maintained earth lodges had known them for generations before any settler drove a stake into Nebraska dirt and called it home. The flat prairie, the roar, the town's walls lying in one direction. She remembered the voice of a freighter leaning from his wagon seat on a bright October morning, laughing at an old woman kneeling in the dirt with a sharpened rib bone and a length of cord. She's digging a grave big enough for herself. Mara pressed her palm against the earth roof. Beneath her hand, the boards of the medicine wagon were dark with years of breath and candle smoke and the particular dampness that comes from a structure that has been alive with human warmth for longer than some of the humans remember. The painted slogan had faded to a ghost. The floor was worn smooth by the feet and knees and sleeping bodies of everyone who had passed through. Children were told not to jump on that rectangle of earth, not because it was fragile. It was the strongest surface in the settlement, backed by oak and iron and decades of packed clay. They were told because it was not empty earth. It was the place where the wind, which owned everything above the grass, had arrived one October and found nothing to grab and passed over without understanding why. The town survived because one woman understood that on the prairie, the strongest wall was the one the storm could not see.